Hello. In this so fresh and so clean episode of the A is for Architecture podcast, Fernando Lara, Professor of Architecture at the Weitzman School of Design, University of Pennsylvania, discusses his book, Spatial Theories for the Americas, Counterweights to 5 Centuries of Eurocentrism, published by the University of Pittsburgh Press in 2024. Spatial Theories for the Americas critiques the dominance of Eurocentric, Cartesian and, let's be honest, elitist epistemologies in architectural and urban studies, imposed through the colonial-modernist project in built form, particularly as they impinge upon the articulation of indigenous practices, spatial knowledges and cultural forms. Fernando contends that these perspectives fail to reflect the unique realities of the American built world as it was when first encountered by Europeans in the late 15th and 16th centuries, the legacy of which persists to this day. To address this, the book proposes new theories from multiple disciplines forming a fresh, self-determined Amerindian vision. It's as good as it sounds. Believe.
A is for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the A is for Architecture podcast. I'm delighted to be talking today to Fernando Lara. Professor Fernando, thank you so much for joining me. We're going to be talking about your wonderful and very, very provocative, in a productive sense, new book, Spatial Theories for the Americas, Counterweights to 5 Centuries of Eurocentrism, which you published with the University of Pittsburgh Press in 2024, I believe.
Correct.
As I said, it's a very, very interesting book, and I'm very excited to be talking about it with you. I should say also that it was Pablo Meninato who put us in contact. But actually, I used your work in my own PhD a long time ago.
Oh, wow.
Using another piece of yours from 2005. So this is a kind of really interesting thing that I never thought would happen. So I'm delighted that it is happening. But before we get to the book and a discussion around that, would you, as all my guests do, introduce yourself, please?
Sure. I'm very, very happy to be here talking to you today. I'm Fernando Lara, and I teach architectural history and theory here at the University of Pennsylvania. And before that in Japan, I moved here 3 years ago. Before that in Japan, I was born in Brazil, and I have lived my entire life between Brazil and the US. By now, more time in the US than in Brazil. But I like to think that I have this Pan-American soul, that I gravitate between the North and South of the Americas. And that has been part of my academic interest forever. I kept expanding my scope. I started 25 years ago with a PhD on Brazilian modern architecture. And then I wrote a lot about Latin American architecture, especially when I was teaching at the University of Texas, very strong Latin American study center there. And now in the last 10 years, I decided that I don't recognize the Rio Grande, Rio Bravo as a border between two Americas. I see a lot of similarities in the spatial history of the Americas, especially the way that very ancient history are still here with us, and we are still struggling with spatial violence that happened centuries ago. So I devote my scholarship now to trying to theorize the spaces of the Americas and push back a little bit on how Eurocentric our knowledge base is, transplanted to this new space. I like to say that Euro thought and Western civilization is fundamental. I mean, we are the heirs somehow of Western civilization and European intellectual development, but it's insufficient. So I'm working on the insufficiencies of that knowledge base in order to have a better understanding of the Americas.
That's a wonderful description, and I do like this idea of being a Pan-American. It's a very sort of an elegant introduction to what you're talking about. As I understand it, is your proposition here that this deficiency derives from, in a way, the kind of propaganda around modernity as being a universalist paradigm. And actually, rather, what we have is a series of competing paradigms, but one of which has become dominant in scholarship.
So let me tell you how I came to this chain of thought. For about 20 years, the year 2000 to 2020, maybe a little before 2018, writing about Latin American architecture, I had to adjectivize, especially modern architecture. So I had to talk about a incomplete modernization or a conservative modernization or a divergent modernization. Around the year 2015, I started reading a lot of what we call decolonial theory. It's a body of theory from South America, mostly. Arturo Escobar, Walter Mignolo, Henrique do Céu, Aníbal Quijano, Denise Ferreira da Silva, Tusicanqui from Bolivia. And this body of literature taught me that modernization and colonization are one and the same. That's the very strong tenet of the colonial theory, that they are two faces of the same coin. You can't separate modernization from colonization. The moment I understood that, and thinking about architectural history, I thought, I don't need to adjectivize Latin American architecture anymore. The colonization, the ugly side, the dark side of modernization is part of the process. It's not a side effect. It is part of the process. And once you start seeing that, you can see that dark side of modernization everywhere, like in the north of England, or in the south of Italy, or in the way that Spain, Madrid, takes care of Catalonia and the Basque country. It's everywhere. And it explains a lot of the inequalities that rise from modernization. My issue with the Americas is that the history of our spaces was obliterated by this process. And we don't really know well the long history of our spaces, the way we tell the stories of our... Let me tell you how I learned the story of the place I grew up. I grew up in Minas Gerais in Brazil, and the way I learned the story in school, and it's still taught that way 40 years later, is that the Portuguese were moving around, making incursions into the empty landscape of Brazil, and they found gold there in 1697, and there was a gold rush, and that's the beginning of the history. Well, there were people there way before 1697, actually 20,000 years before 1697, and that history is completely erased. That history is completely erased. The same for Philadelphia. Philadelphia was founded by William Penn. Now, wait a minute, there were thousands of people here before William Penn. So bringing that into the conversation dislocates the Eurocentric point of reference and allows us to raise issues that are here, and they are still here.
But this presupposes that this erasure is problematic in the present.
Yes.
So obviously,
right.
It was problematic at the time that forms of physical structural violence were being deployed during the quote-unquote founding of these cities, these places, the occupation or taking over of these places. But given the passage of time and the way things have shaped up through democratic emancipation, through economic changes and so on and so forth, through the law and through changed social relations, why is it still important now to understand it? And I appreciate that this is a little bit of an instrumentalizing question. It becomes a little bit of applied ethics, which is not always good, and it's often clunky. But I'm kind of interested, and I guess to be provocative, I'm kind of interested to try and understand why it's important that we know this.
Well, if you see all the policies of the current president of the United States, they are working exactly on trying to sustain this narrative of white supremacy that founded this country 250 years ago, exactly. And those issues are still here. the people of the America live on this kind of dislocated sense. I mean, there's a Brazilian scholar, Roberto Schwartz, wrote a book that is a classic in Brazilian theory and literary studies called Ideas Out of Place. And we still live all over the Americas, with few exceptions, with our ideas out of place. And this has consequences to the way that we first frame our problems and then frame possible solutions for our problems. I think acknowledging the deep roots of some of our issues and the spatial, in my case, the spatial consequence of those deep histories is important to address what's going on today.
Okay. I sort of agree. I sort of also wonder whether, as you seem to suggest earlier, that this process of modernization, colonialism is not a bug within that, but it is a feature of it. It is, I mean, Hannah Arendt argued that. I'm sure many Marxist and left-wing theorists have argued exactly that it's an inescapable characteristic of that. How does this emerge? Now, in your book, you sort of argue that the Americas were a laboratory for European modernity, that there was, in fact, and this comes back to the idea of decentering modernity or modernization, there was, in fact, a reciprocity between the Americas and the European context, that the Europeans came over with an idea, Cartesian dualism, and that then was inflected back. Am I right in understanding it like that?
Yeah, you're correct. Yeah, you're correct. So one of the central tenets of decolonial theory is that the order of factors of the narrative is reversed. What Mignolo and Dussel and Escobar wrote actually started with Edmundo O'Gorman in Mexico in the 1950s, and then was picked up by Quijano, Escobar, and Mignolo. The order of factor that we were taught is that Europe was modernizing, coming out of the Middle Ages, and was able to cross the ocean and thus was able to control the territories of the Americas. What the decolonial theories show is that it's because they crossed the ocean and was able to control the territory of the Americas that they modernized. The modernization, the rise of capitalism is a consequence of the American invasion, not a cause. When I applied that to architecture, and that is my contribution, I think I did that first. I see that as a discipline, architecture came to being and the processes of slicing space into plan, section, elevation during the 16th century, around exactly the same time that the occupation of the Americas was happening. This is, again, not a coincidence. I like to think that those are two sides of the same process, that the processes of controlling space from afar. And my critique of abstraction, which is what I'm working right now, and the book has a little bit of that, but there are some more recent peer-reviewed papers that I discuss about that. The rise of spatial abstraction that happened in the 16th century, and then it was actually codified by René Descartes after the fact. It was developed mostly by the Mediterraneans, Italians and Spanish and others during the 16th century, Scamozzi, Palladio. The rise of abstraction is a rise of a process of distancing, of control from distance. And we usually teach only the temporal distance of architecture. We design today completely separate from construction what will be built in the future. But it's also the same tool that allows us to control spaces from afar. So London was controlling Philadelphia. Madrid was controlling Mexico City. Lisbon was controlling Salvador da Bahia. It's exactly the same process. It's a process of codifying spatial information for control. And this is an inherent characteristic of architecture. And it was developed in the 16th century. Bits and pieces of it existed before, of course. Drawings existed. Alberti wrote about it in the 20, 25 years before Columbus' trip. Those pieces existed, but they came together in the 16th century to support the business of colonialism. And we still live with that definition of architecture.
Yeah, for sure. I like this. I think this is really interesting, but I want to understand René Descartes' role in this before, because obviously Cartesianism and the Cartesian plane is used in architecture as a kind of default, as you say. It's still very much a ghost we live with. Can you explain it? And can you explain how this is then realized in the European city and then, I guess, in the spaces of the colonized?
So the translation of space into numeric variables, the translation of space into coordinates, is something that was developed by Portuguese, Spanish, and Italian navigators throughout the 16th century. They had that need. They were too far from the Iberian Peninsula to use itineraries. And scholars of geography like Ricardo Padrón, Doreen Massey, they discuss this time, the 16th century, with a change from itineraries to maps. Colombo had an itinerary. Magellan and Vespucci, they had itineraries. In the itinerary, you, the person who are moving, are inside the description. The description moves with you as you go through space. The development of coordinates to apply to space, what we now call Cartesian coordinates, but it was developing 100 years before René Descartes, mostly in the early 16th century. Those coordinates allowed for a separation. In a map, the navigator is not represented. What is represented is everything else. And that was actually what I think René Descartes did. And I'm no expert in Descartes. I'm just fascinated by how he managed to do it. What I think he did is he was able to create a synthesis. And his extensa, his cogitans, is exactly that separation. Like there is a concept in the mind, and there is the representation of everything else. It's exactly the separation that shows the map is not an itinerary. You are outside of the description. And it's exactly the separation that we do as architects. We separate the concept of a building from the actual building. And all of this, I think, came together in the 16th century. And it's both a tool and a consequence of colonialism. It's instrumental for colonialism, and it's also feedback into the processes of control that were developed in the 16th century.
I think this is really fascinating idea. I know, again, to go to Hannah Arendt, and I reference Hannah Arendt a lot because I like her. This idea of Galileo's decentering the Earth from the cosmos through his telescope is a process of alienation, that it creates this distancing between us and the cosmos in that case. So it kind of depopulates it and it depersonalizes it. It becomes a very abstract thing. And it seems to me that you're saying that the use of Cartesian ideas in mapping specifically creates that same form of distancing. And that same form of distancing therefore enables not just the division of space, but also the othering of peoples.
So think about it this way, just so that we can move on from René Descartes. Descartes wrote in the early 17th century, 100 years after those ideas were instrumentalized by the cartographers of the Mediterranean. Descartes wrote at a time that the Europeans were killing each other for the Reformation, for the Protestants versus the Catholics. He's a Catholic. He's a Jesuit. He went to Jesuit school. But he's a unanimous. Everybody loves Descartes. Nobody cares that he's a Catholic or a Protestant. He was able to bypass this fierce division that was putting armies against armies throughout the entire 16th and 17th century in Europe. Why? Why he is such a unanimous? Because he provided the theological synthesis. There was a problem at the time, and again, I'm stepping way outside of my confidence area here. There was a theological problem of time of space and religion, God and space, and Descartes provided the synthesis for that problem that also supported colonialism, supported this dehumanization, right? I mean, so some human beings, usually men, usually European and white, are rational, are cogitans. Everybody else is extensa. Everybody else is nature, not rational enough. That synthesis was loved by all the powers of the world when it came up in the early 17th century. But the architecture was already systematized when that synthesis came about.
Let us leave behind cogito and approach the Amerindian perspectivism that you speak about, which is, as you describe it, a sort of a relational and embodied approach to things. What is this Amerindian perspectivism?
So to make the bridge with Cartesianism, Amerindian perspectivism is a whole understanding of nature based on approximation, not distance. It was developed by Eduardo Viveiros de Castro, Brazilian anthropologist. Viveiros de Castro, early in his career, he did research in the north of the Amazon with the Yanomami and south of the Amazon with the Xingu. Those are very different civilizations, probably 500, 600 miles apart. The Yanomami at the border with Venezuela, the Xingu at the savannah, they're actually outside of the Amazon proper area. And he realized that they had something in common, which is an idea that nature and us are one and the same. So he uses this example of a pebble. You go to the river, you find a pebble, you clean the pebble, you polish the pebble, you drill a hole in the pebble, you hang the pebble on your neck, and the pebble becomes more human, and you gain a little bit of pebbleness. You become pebble when you work with this little stone. And that applies to everything. That applies to our relationship with our pets, right? Of course, I have 2 dogs, and they are super humanized because I relate to them so much. A relationship with food, a relationship with the whole nature. So Amerindian perspectivism is this idea that everything has human potential. A parrot can become more human if he or she interacts with humans. A piece of wood becomes more human if you turn that wood into a tool and you use that as a chair or as a spoon. All of that becomes human, and you becomes woody when you interact with wood every day and learn the characteristics of that piece of material. That is the exact opposite of the separation of recogitans and res extensa. And I think we operate in our lives both ways. We have those deep relationships with non-humans, with objects. We just don't have the vocabulary to express them the way that a Yanomami would. We are blocked by our own Cartesianism, and we can't accept some of the relationships we already have with our things.
So how does this Amerindian perspectivism appear in architectural space? And obviously using the word architectural here is sort of in a way, and I think we'll come to this question in a second, but sort of in a way applying a kind of modernist description.
Of course, yes. We live in this modern colonial architectural realm. What I'm arguing for is that we need to open space in the design process for those other variables. Like, how do we bring emotions into the design process? I mean, we are really good at manipulating everything that can be drawn. Or nowadays manifested in a computer file, in BIM or anything else, any other software package you use. We are really good at manipulating that, but there are variables that are excluded from that process. Emotion is one of them. Community values is another. Deep memory is another. Those variables are excluded for a reason. They were not useful to the process of modernization, colonization a few centuries ago. And I think we still struggle to bring those variables into the design process. And it's something that I argue that we need to open that space. We need to find ways to incorporate those dimensions.
But how is this manifest, or how, as a historian, and I guess as an anthropologist, as an archaeologist, how has the non-Western approach, the Amerindian perspectivism, been seen in non-Western environments? It's difficult to do that, I understand, because modernization has diffused very generally around the world. So everything is, to some degree, inflected by it. But what would we expect to see in a space that wasn't formed through this?
I think we don't see it, and we have tremendous difficulty. At the conclusion of the book, the conclusion chapter, I tell a little story of a native Brazilian leader, a cacique, the leader of a native Brazilian group in Pernambuco, Brazil, who was using architecture as a way to bring his community together and bring back ancient knowledge about sites and buildings and ways of living over there. They are by now very impoverished peasants. They don't live the traditional ways anymore. But he was trying to use architecture to bring that back, and a friend puts us in contact because he knows I'm interested and I should write something about it. I did wrote a piece for Arc Daily. It's there. But talking to this cacique, he was telling me his ideas, etc. And my friend, who's an architect over there, was by his side and was telling Chicão, his name, tell Fernando about how you choose the site. And he didn't want to tell me how he chose the site. There was a little bit of a resistance. And we were on the phone. I was in the US and he was there. And then I picked that up and I said, Chicão, please tell me how you choose the site. So he chose the site the traditional way of his ethnic group. He woke up before sunrise, he went to the field and looked for a specific bird. It's like the ema, it's like a big chicken or a small ostrich, road runner, they call it on the US. I don't know how they call it in England. And this bird, they sleep on trees, on the branches of the trees for protection. And in the morning, it comes up to graze, comes down to graze. So the place where the group of emas start grazing in the morning, that's a good site for building the community hall. He told me that. I finished the phone call. I sit down to write for an architectural magazine, architectural journal. And I thought, oh my God, I can't write this. I don't have the capability. I don't have the vocabulary. I can't, I mean, how do I translate this story to my fellow architects? I felt completely ignorant of an entire body of knowledge that I could not translate. That's the reason. I mean, I am convinced that there is a tremendous amount of knowledge out there about space. And it's not only Native American, it's also in different areas of China, South Asia, in India, the Indonesian peninsula, in most parts of Africa. There are tremendous amount of knowledge over there. that are untranslatable to our Western architectural traditions. And I think it's our loss. I think we need to open up the sensibility to bring those knowledges into our conversation.
You mentioned, and I think it's a beautiful idea, how the pebble becomes more human and the human becomes more pebble through this process of finding the pebble and using it or interacting with it. Is the Amerindian perspectivism, is the indigenous, non-cartesian, non-imperial, non-colonial way of encountering buildings in the same vein? Is it that one generates or creates a relationship with the materials and the spaces and the context and the climate and the cosmos and the deities and the fruit in the trees? And through that process, we become, to a certain degree, unified with the building itself, both as a psycho-spiritual and social artifact, but also as a material entity.
Yeah, that's part of what I think we should move forward. There's another component of Amerindian perspectivism that is also interesting. In all the civilizations of the Americas, the low density ones, it's different on the high density civilizations of Central Mexico or Peru and the Incas, the Aztecs, the Mayas. Those high density stratified societies are different. But in the low density, the Mississippi Valley, the Great Lakes, the Amazonian, the Guarani, the Mapuche, they don't have death penalty. The worst penalty possible is exile. You are expelled from the group of humans and you have to live by yourself. That's the worst penalty for the worst criminals. Why? Because it makes you less human. What makes you human is the conversation and the constant contact with other humans. If you apply that today to our digital lives, that has, of course, a beautiful side. It allows us to be talking here 5,000 miles apart, I believe we are, something like that. But it's also making us less humans because we have this less contact. We have this mediation. Think about what social media is doing to our group decisions as nations, as groups. And I think there's something to be learned from Amerindian perspectivism on what is important. How can we sustain and nurture human contact in our current times?
And if you take that position, that then can be spatialized. That can be imagined as a spatial program, can't it?
Yes, because I think there is a certain quality in being in the same room, right? I mean, we lose something by being mediated by this digital tool here that puts you on my screen. So I think there's something to be in defense of architecture, in defense of good public spaces and spaces for people to come together. There is something really valuable in sharing the same space that I think we are letting go slowly.
Yeah, for sure. Well, modernity is in a strange kind of way seemingly accelerating. I think the postmodernists probably jumped the gun a little bit. It wasn't postmodern at all. It was just a different sort of modern. But I want to come on to something that you mention in your book, this idea of theorizing the undrawn, in which you talk about how our modes of knowing, our modes of architectural knowing and our languages erases spaces which don't fit into that categorization. And you mentioned earlier this very beautiful description of the foundation of community center in Brazil and how you didn't have the language to talk about that, really. I hope you did talk about it. I hope you...
I try. I can only try.
But I'm particularly interested in this idea. I'm particularly interested in this unseeing that we do because we don't have the language for it. But I'm also really interested in the problematic and how you square that circle of once you've encountered this thing, once you've seen this thing, How do we use the tools to hand as Western scholars, as architects, as designers? How do we use the tools that we have to adequately describe without forcing them into frameworks of abstraction and alienation?
So, growing up in Brazil, my parents bought an apartment on what was then the outskirts of the city, the most affordable apartment they could have at that time, 1971, when they bought it. And behind the wall of my apartment building was a favela. So I grew up one wall away from a favela. And my friends playing soccer on the streets, riding bicycles, flying kites. Some of them lived in buildings like mine, and some of them lived in the favela. And then I had to go to school. I had English classes, I had, music classes, and they still stayed there on the streets. When I went to architecture school, there was no mention of a favela. It didn't exist. I actually I remember at the map library of my university, in the same city, I opened the maps, and the favela areas were dashed lines that represented a parceling of the land that never actually happened. So it's like my street continued through the hill, but the street didn't continue. It started being a favela 50 meters from my apartment, from my house. That was completely erased. That was not recognized. Many, many years later, doing research about the dissemination of modern vocabulary and modern spatiality, I went to talk to the builders who built the favela, and I went to study their buildings. And I realized a number of things. First, they have a formal logic. The spatial logic is based on the economics of one kind of slab. It's a prefabricated slab that is very common in Brazil, and that becomes the module of all the favelas in Brazil because it's cheap and affordable, and everybody knows how to do it. So I run a couple of studios measuring that, documenting that. The students were absolutely fascinated by that process. And then it came to me that we call them informal. And when we call them informal, what we are doing is we are placing them outside of the realm of architecture, because architecture is about form. And I do believe that architecture is about form. So when we call something informal, we are pushing that outside of the boundaries and say, we don't deal with that. That is informal. But wait a minute, they have form. They do have form. They have a structural logic. They have an economic logic. They have a spatial logic. And it's just not the same as the buildings, whether we design them or the contractor just, do copies and copies of the same building, like the one I grew up. And thinking about it, I decided that I should call them the undrawn, because those buildings were never drawn. The process is precisely the reverse of the regular process, right? In regular process, you take property of the land, you take ownership of the land, then you design, then you build, then you inhabit. The favela process is the precise opposite. First, you have to be there, inhabit, claim that land. Then you build. And there is no drawing. So maybe later, decades later, if you happen to have a progressive mayor, you might be able to get some document of land ownership, some legalization, if you're lucky. In that reverse process, the drawing is missing. Now, the drawing is an optimizing machine. So there is a lot of pathology, there's a lot of waste in the favela buildings. They're not good buildings. They are awful, wasteful buildings with problems of layout, problems of ventilation, problems of, there are all kinds of problems that come from the absence of planning, the absence of drawing. But when I started understanding drawings also as a tool for control, as a tool for state control, and capitalist control, and I started reading a long literature that comes from Afro-Brazilian scholars showing the favelas as spaces of resistance, a resistance against the oppression of the white supremacy state that run Brazil as a colony and then as an independent nation, and it's still there. We're still struggling with that racialized capitalism. I thought, wait a minute, it's also a resistance against documentation. There is a component there that by not drawing, you are telling the state and the powers to be F you. I do whatever I want here. I am not under your control of your building codes, your guidelines, uh, I'll build my own house. Uh, so I think that component is there and needs to be discussed in order to understand if we really want to improve those spaces, if we really want to improve the life of the people who live there. And I'm very cynical that the capitalist structure wants to improve their lives. I think there's part of the structure that really wants this reservoir of cheap labor that they there is this hope, right? That with time, everybody will be lifted and everybody will live in good housing with sanitation and ventilation, et cetera, et cetera. And the cynical in me says, wait a minute, the production structure of capitalism don't want everybody to be lifted up and improve. They want the reservoir of cheap labor.
Yeah, I mean, we should probably trust them when they say it out loud. And
Yeah.
all the evidence since the Reformation has been they really like cheap labor.
Yeah.
They're quite keen on stuffing children down coal mines.
Yeah.
They don't
Right.
mind.
Yeah.
They don't mind. I'm mindful of the time, but I did want to follow that up, which seems to me to be that there is also in this inadequacy, as you describe it, of the favela construction technique. It seems to me that there's, in this Amerindian perspectivism, there is at play a very distinct hierarchy of values, much closer to, well, a long way away from the Maslowian idea of people will always sort of look to satisfy their existential needs before moving towards some form of complex socio-spiritual need. But actually, perhaps what you see when you see what we would describe as sort of inefficiencies is, as you note, both a sort of act of resistance, but also simply that that's not important and something else is higher up that hierarchy. I remember very distinctly when I lived briefly in Mexico when I was writing my master's thesis, and I was living in Yucatan, and in this little coastal village around the coast from Cancun, and it was full of European and North American settlers. And across the lane, you know, their big glossy walls with broken glass cemented into the top, across the lane was where the service staff essentially lived. And there was a man who lived in a very rundown house. He had loads of kids, and he had a glossy horse. Beautiful thing. And on Sundays, he'd take the children out for rides on the horse. And I thought, this is really interesting. His house is not where it could be, but he's got a horse, which is pretty cool, you know. And this just struck me, and I romanticize it because that's what I do, but it just struck me as being this wonderful example of this, not inverted, but a completely different ordering of values, which I think Manfred Max Neff talked about in his human scale development. This idea that actually there's a much more complex matrix of need satisfaction, which perhaps we see manifest in the indigenous voice of the Americas or the indigenous voices of the Americas. Is that a reasonable?
My issue is that looking at our architectural knowledge, looking at our books, our libraries, the way we operate as a profession, we have mostly ignored all those knowledges. We have a self-referential definition of architecture, right? We call architecture the buildings designed by architects,
Yeah.
and not any architects, few architects, the ones who were able to rise up to the higher places of our own construction. So we live inside this fictional narrative. Uh, Meanwhile, there's a huge thing out there that we call the built environment, because they were not designed by architects. And that's the reality. That's the real place where people live. Uh, and I think we should bring that into consideration. We should bring that into our teachings, into our schools, into our discussions. Uh, can you imagine a medical doctor saying that, oh, medicine is only about those illnesses over there, over here, that other illnesses over there, that other pathologies, it's not my concern. It's something else. It's uh, social issues. I think we do a disservice to our profession that I like so much and I'm so proud of when we have such a narrow definition of what architecture is. Uh,
Yeah.
I think one of the issues is to expand this definition to include, in my opinion, include every piece of space modified by human beings. If you have a human being modifying space, you have some kind of architecture. Whether we need another word for that or not, it's a kind of architecture.
Yes. Maybe. Maybe. I've been thinking about this a lot. I would like a narrower definition of architecture, and I would like other definitions for other forms of things. Like, for example, the tower blocks that they build in cities, I don't think is architecture.
Right. Yeah.
I think it's building systems management,
Yeah.
maybe. The glass and steel thing, that
Yeah.
peculiar thing. But anyway, I want to come on to this last prompt that I sent you, which is to ask you a little bit about how we counter this abstraction. Like,
Hmm.
obviously, it's important for the indigenous and the marginalized to be reconnected with their
Hmm.
voice, the lost voice or the buried voice or the sidelined voice, or better perhaps to create space for those voices that are actually very active to be made visible and encountered in architectural discourse. So how do we do this? How, within the realms of this beautiful and strange abstracting mode of architecture that we deploy, we are part of, how do we make that space? Now, far as I know, you say participation.
It's one of the ways. Participation is one of the ways. It's a political way to give voice to whoever is going to live in that space.
Mm.
Uh, but I think any process of approximation is valid at this moment. Uh, and any process of distancing is problematic. And the approximation has so many different uh, kind of facets or frameworks. Like phenomenology is one kind of approximation. It highlights your relationship with the spaces. Uh, Teaching here at Penn, I cannot avoid the inheritance, the heritage of two giants, right? Louis Kahn and Venturi and Scott Brown. And Denise Scott Brown is still alive, and she's here. She's fragile, 93 years old, but she's still here. Uh, Louis Kahn, for instance, when he says, "Ask a brick what it wants to be," that's an approximation. That's a way to, engage with the material and give the material some level of agency. It's a pretty fictional agency, but just ask the brick what it wants to be means I don't have full control. I'm not the little god that is creating the entire world out of my mind. I mean, I'm deferring to brick, and I'm asking brick what it should be, what it wants to be. And the same with Venturi and Scott Brown, especially Denise Scott Brown. Her sensibility for the vernacular was very revolutionary in the 1960s in the U.S. Ivy League context. And she was fierce, and she suffered a lot by insisting that we talk to people, that we, of course, going back to that chapter that I talk about Jane Jacobs and Denise Scott Brown, and then I talk a little bit about my own work in the favelas and the popular modernism. But I think there are several ways in which we can approximate, like Hal Erskine in the Nordic countries and in Newcastle. He was doing some kind of approximation back in the 1970s. I remember discussing him in school, and I only visited this past year in February the Bikers Lane in Newcastle. There are many of those moments in the history of architecture that we should elevate, and instead we have a tendency to elevate the more abstract moments of either Mies or Corbusier, or even the current work of Zaha Hadid and Frank Gehry. They are very distancing from the human experience, and I advocate for giving space to works of architecture that approximate the human component to the built component.
It's a bit messy though, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And sorry, I have no answers. I'm only raising a couple of questions here. That's actually something that the first time I published this work, I did a article in a peer-reviewed journal, the Plant Journal. The article was published in 2020. The peer review process was in 2019. And one of the reviewers, anonymous, I will never know who wrote this, but this person wrote something like, I don't know if this author can answer those questions, but the questions are good enough. I felt that was very complimentary, and I hold on to that idea. I have no idea if I can ever answer those questions, but I'm happy raising the questions. That's it.
That's wonderful. That's a great point to finish on. Fernando, thank you so very much.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure talking to you.
You have come to the shore. There are no instructions. Amen, Denise Levertov. Amen indeed. Thank you to Fernando for agreeing to speak with me and for inspiring bits of my own thesis those many moons ago. Thanks to Leslie Rains at the University of Pittsburgh Press for the PDF of the book. Please see the podcast descriptions for links to the book and to Fernando at work on his personal website and on the socials. And thanks for listening.